We are nearing the end of this fabulous day. We will round off with one of our most popular speakers from a couple of years ago, and then regroup with all of the stars of today for a group discussion. When we host the conference in Stockholm, we usually give the speakers some kind of a gift. This year, we will spare them the porcelain and inedible licorice. Instead, we will donate a sizable sum of money to Mind, a non-profit organization that works with mental health issues. Of seemingly sound mind is our final speaker, the ever-entertaining, always educational Jake Knapp, inventor of the design sprint and a best-selling New York Times author. Designers are rarely in charge. We have to work hard to make people listen to us. Jake has been ignored, yelled at, and occasionally made an ass of himself. But occasionally, he's managed to get through to the CEOs he's worked with. How to do that is something I'm sure we are all interested in learning. Please welcome Jake Knapp.
Hi, I'm Jake Knapp, and usually I talk about design sprints, but today I promise not to. Instead, I'm going to be talking about CEOs, specifically how to lead your CEO, which is a pretty cheeky talk title, I must say, and I'm not quite sure how I got myself into this. However, here we go. Now, normally this is a product and design conference, so you would expect if we're talking about CEOs, there ought to be a lot of quotes from a certain CEO who was amazing. But although there are lots of interesting things I'm sure we could say about Steve Jobs, I'm not going to. I'm not going to talk about design sprints. I promise not to talk about Steve Jobs either. I want to bring you some news stories, things you haven't heard before. And I want to talk about the thing that CEOs do. And the reason why I don't want to talk about that certain CEO is that he's just too much of an exception. He had such clarity about how to get his strategy into the real world. You know, create the iPhone, you have that vision. Nobody else had it, created it, got it out there. And that's just something that most CEOs, normal CEOs is who I want to talk about. The 99.999% of CEOs, they're not these once in 1,000 years geniuses. So when you ask ourselves this question of how to lead your CEO, I think we're looking for ways to meaningfully help folks who do not have necessarily perfect vision, maybe not all the time. All right. Because all of us want to have an influence in what we do. Now you might be saying to yourself, Jake, talking about CEOs, what do you know about it? What do you know about what it is to be a CEO, to run a big organization? Have you been a CEO? Well, no. No, I haven't. I've been more like this, kind of at the ground level, and really the ground level of organizations that are much bigger than even this pyramid suggests, organizations with, tens of thousands of people in them. Some of the stories I want to tell are about these interactions I had with the CEO when I was a nobody and I had no influence, and the outcome, maybe was not so great. I want to tell you about the things I learned from that. I want to tell you about things I learned from interactions that maybe, went better in that context, and also about my experiences with startups over the last 10 years, where I've really learned a lot. And it kind of all comes together into a theory about how to lead your CEO. I have a very simple theory that I'll share with you. And I hope you might find it useful. I don't know, but it's very simple. That's the good part. It's simple. And there's stories to go with it. So CEOs, if we accept this idea that their job is to get the strategy into the world, to decide what strategy to take, to have clarity about how to get into the world, then if you want to lead your CEO, what you probably need to be able to offer her or them, you need to offer them the perfect idea. If you can give them the perfect idea, then you or me, in this case, in this story, if I offer them the perfect idea, I sort of elevate to CEO level. I get some of that CEO stardust on me, which would be great. Would that be great? Okay. Well, I'll tell you a story about when I worked at Microsoft a long time ago. I had the perfect idea. A colleague and I had this idea. Here's the idea. You know sticky notes, like the little, yellow things they stick, Post-it notes, whatever you call them. Sticky notes, they're great, right? Everybody would agree those are great. What if those were digital? Okay. Now, I'm not talking about an online whiteboard like we have nowadays with COVID and everything. I'm talking about a digital sticky note that is also a device, a hardware device with, this is in the early 2000s, a hardware device with a black and white screen and a stylus, pretty bulky because the batteries weren't so great at that time. A hardware device, it's a sticky note. It's not sticky. And so anyway, yeah, the idea we had was that maybe, a family might buy, a bunch of these, everybody'd have one, there'd be one stuck to the fridge with magnets, and you could be all over the city and you could write a sticky note and it would show up on your fridge. Now, in hindsight, this may not have been the perfect idea. But at the time I thought it was, and I worked a long time on this idea, kind of on the side, kind of sneakily working on it, putting together designs. And my friend helped me code some stuff up. And we went to the Microsoft Science Fair. Once a year, Science Fair, all of these people from Microsoft gathered to share these ideas, cool projects they've been working on. And at some point during the day, Bill Gates, founder, CEO of Microsoft, will show up, look around, and what might happen, what you dream might happen, is that Bill would look at your project and he'd say, wow, this is great. This is exciting. This is what gets me excited about technology, Jake, if he said that. Jake, this is what gets me excited about technology. I want to start a big project to do this thing, digital Post-it notes. What a great idea. What a great hardware idea. I want to give you a big team and a bunch of money to do this thing. That's the dream. That was the dream. So this was my chance to encounter Bill Gates, who I had never seen before in person. We're at the fair. We've set up our table. We've got all of our sticky note prototypes out there. And finally, I spot him. Bill Gates is across from me. He comes closer. He's in front of our table. He takes a look at what we got. He takes a look, and he just leaves. He doesn't say anything. And I felt bad. And I thought, okay, that didn't go well. Well, I'll figure it out next time. So later in my career, I'm working at Google. I have what's called a 20% project. At Google, you're encouraged to take 20% of your time, do whatever you want. So we've got a 20% project. It's called Google Meeting. And our idea is to do video calls in the web browser. This would turn out to be a better idea than the first one, maybe. I thought it was perfect. And before we'd made a prototype, which is a story I often tell this time when we made a prototype, before that, I had what I thought was the perfect design, all detailed out and ready to share with Google CEO, Eric Schmidt. So we had the opportunity on our team to do a product review with Eric Schmidt to show, and I was ready to show this perfect design. So go into the room, Eric shows up, and tell him all about how perfect it is, how well I've thought it through, how exactly perfect every detail is. And then he asked me a bunch of questions about the business model, and then he leaves. And once again, I was left feeling like, oh man, God, screwed it up. Don't get many of those chances, screwed it up. Didn't have the perfect plan, I guess. Anyway, that was frustrating. Other thing I was working on at Google at that time, Gmail. I had a 20% project in Gmail. There was an engineer who'd come up with this idea he called Priority Inbox, and the idea was to use machine learning to automatically sort email to get the important stuff up to the forefront, hopefully save people time in email so people would spend less time in their email, which is a challenge even to this day. So this was a side project, and it was hard for me to get, I got interested, but it was hard for me to get other people to help. But I did get my friend Annie Chen, she's an amazing front-end engineer, and she agreed to help me for 1 month. She just finished a project. She said, look, I'll give you 4 weeks. Let's work on this for 4 weeks. If we can turn this into something in 4 weeks, then, maybe I'll keep working on it. But if we haven't made progress in 4 weeks, I'm going to go join a real project. So we came up with a plan that each week of those 4 weeks, we would design a prototype. She'd build it, hack it into the code, and few hundred Googlers who'd signed up for this would get this in their inbox. So one prototype a week, we did this. We built and prototyped a new version of the inbox, a new way to sort the email. We had different ideas for how that might work each week of that month. And by the end of the month, it wasn't exactly clear what we should do, but we learned a lot. And I realized, gosh, now we got to decide, are we going to invest in this or not? And Larry Page was now the CEO of Google. He was one of the founders of Google, and he was the CEO again, and really interested in Gmail, really wanted to be involved in every decision about Gmail. So I thought, this hasn't gone well before, but what's going to happen now is we're going to need to show Larry what we've got. So we're going to need to make decisions. We're going to need to come up with the perfect plan to propose to him. But before that happened, I thought back. I sort of thought back in time, and I remembered all of the things that had happened. I remembered the ghosts of things that had happened that had been, unpleasant. And then I thought even further back, and I remembered a meeting that I had gone to. Now, it hadn't been me who was presenting. I just happened to be in the room. And I remembered a meeting of the search team. And this meeting was run by Marissa Mayer. Marissa Mayer was the head of search. She wasn't the CEO, although she would later become the CEO of Yahoo. So she was at that level. And what she was doing was reviewing different proposals for new features for search. And what struck me about the meeting, I remembered, was, wow, people came and they showed Marissa different options. And she would say, yeah, do this, don't do this, test this. She gave them some clear advice about what to do. And this notion of having options coming without the perfect plan, it actually seemed to work quite well. I thought that was much different than my approach. And I thought maybe what needs to happen is that we come to the meeting without a conclusion. We let Larry help us. He's a smart guy, right? So go to the meeting. There's Larry. Say, look, Larry, here are the different things we've learned. Here's what we've tried. Here's sort of what we suggest. And Larry, I don't even think is listening. He's looking at his computer. He's flipping through the different options. And he says, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to have the important messages on the top, then starred messages, then everything else. People will read the new important messages. They'll star the ones they want to keep. Those will stay below, and then everything else will be at the bottom. Now, this was similar to one of the designs we had tested, but he'd figured out the flow that he wanted to have, and he just sort of mandated, here's what you're going to do. It was, he closed his laptop. I wanted to talk more, explain my point of view, but already he had his laptop under his arm and he was out of there. And I thought, oh man, I'm supposed to be the designer on this. He just swept my responsibility right out from under me. This sucks. Once again, foiled. In the big meeting, once again, I blew it. But then I was thinking about it and I was like, well, actually, we were just kind of hoping he would give us a thumbs up so we could continue. And he didn't really say, hey, great job, guys, but implicitly, we get to keep working on this. He thought it was interesting. And he used components of stuff I had worked on the design for. So maybe for my ego's sake, I could just tell people that it was my design in the first place. This is pretty good, I thought. So I realized that this notion of having the perfect idea wasn't quite right. Instead, it occurred to me that what I needed to do was create choices. My job, I realized, finally, I'd been working as a designer for 10 years. Finally, my job is to create choices for the CEO. I'm here to create choices, to give them some paths they might consider, to try to help elucidate or clarify which path we can take or which paths we can take, and then maybe leave it up to them. I decided that's what I should be doing here. But I started to think about, and had been thinking a lot about, processes and how teams worked and how hard it was to start projects. And something about that Gmail project was really interesting to me, the forced time function. And I had recently had another project where we had finally gotten Google Meet off the ground after that disastrous review. We had finally made a prototype and tested it with other Googlers, with our teams, and gotten things going. And I thought, man, there's something to this. And so I started a new 20% project. Now, earlier, I told you I promised I wouldn't talk about the design sprint in this talk. I'm afraid to tell you that I lied. it's very hard for me to not talk about the design sprint because I'm really into it. So I started this 20% project. It was called the Design Sprint. In 2010, while working at Google, I ran the first one, the very first design sprint. And then over the next few years, I ran a bunch. And I eventually switched to working at Google Ventures, where I was working with startups, their founders, small teams now, totally different organizational dynamics. So even though I wasn't a genius, I didn't have the firsthand experience of being a CEO. I didn't necessarily have any influence over them. I was just there and got the chance to work with a bunch of different CEOs. I got to experience what it was like from their standpoint when I could be in the room with them for a week as they were getting going on a project. This was pretty cool. And one of the things that I learned was, hey, CEOs are human. I'll never forget spending a week in the room with Ann Wojcicki, who's the CEO and founder of 23andMe, and realizing for the first time, oh my gosh, this person who's famous to me, person I'd seen on TV, person who, when I came into the room on my first week of Google Ventures and my boss, Bill, was like, don't mind me, Ann, I'm just going to sit here and watch what Jake does. And I was like, oh my God. But then when I spent a sprint with Ann, I realized Ann's a regular person. And I realized that founders in general, they'd had an idea. They're certainly smart people, right? Very smart. But they'd had an idea that maybe they got some folks to help them get going on it. The idea started to work. Maybe they start to make money or it started to look promising. They got some investment, started to hire some people. And this notion of them at the top of the pyramid, they were still regular humans. And I know that seems obvious probably to you, but to me, this was a big epiphany. Wow, they're actually regular humans. And I also realized that in their efforts to try to get that vision into the real world, well, it wasn't this crystal clear, we just have this exact perfect thing in mind, we just need to execute it. It's not like that. There's a fog in between the strategy and the real world. The CEO, the founder, they may have a vision, but they don't necessarily know what form it should take and how people in the real world will react and how to bridge through that fog. So as I was running all these design sprints, I started to go from just a tool for getting prototypes, a tool for getting some choices in front of CEOs, to really fine-tuning how can you give the CEO the best possible opportunity to make a good decision and clear through that fog. Over the course of those years, I was experimenting, taking notes, seeing what worked, what didn't work, tweaking the process until finally I had this checklist. And with my colleagues at Google Ventures, we developed this checklist that ultimately made it into the sprint book. So I should tell you what a design sprint is. I've talked enough about it that I'd tell you a little bit more, explain what it is and how it relates to this decision-making theory that I'm going to tell you at the end. So the design sprint starts with a big project that you're sort of kicking off and a team of people and a week of time. You clear your schedule for that week. And during that week, instead of the normal meetings and events, calendar, you're clearing it. Email, you're leaving it alone. Slack, forget about it for a second. You'll see how ironic that is in a second. And you run this checklist of activities, starting on Monday with the focal point of making a map. Bunch of activities with the big pictures, you're making a map. Now, the problem for many teams, and for me, when I was building these perfect ideas and trying to pitch them to the CEO, the problem for me is the big picture sometimes gets lost. Sometimes in getting into all the minutiae of the details, which eventually will need to be figured out, the big picture gets lost. And one of the, I think, great frustrations for CEOs, one of the reasons why Eric Schmidt was skewering me was I wasn't thinking about the big picture, the business, how it all fit together. In a design sprint, we start off by looking at the big picture with fresh eyes, bringing people in who have all kinds of perspectives from the team, and making a map and asking key questions. What are the things that might trip us up and cause us to fail? How are we going to measure it if we succeed? Choosing a target that we can focus on. Who's the most important customer type for us to be successful as a business? What's the moment that's the most crucial? On Tuesday, we sketch solutions. So whereas I was falling in love with one idea when I worked on my own, in a design sprint, we can create a competition by using our colleagues. So all of us come up with a solution on our own, individually, an opinionated, here's what I think should happen without having to discuss it, without having to pitch it. We put it on paper in detail. And then we've got a battle royale. It's the Hunger Games of solutions. On Wednesday, we're going to decide among all these different competing solutions. Now, the problem that I'd had, the boss swoops and poops at the end. I've put in weeks or months of work on this idea, and the boss swoops and poops, or swoops and doesn't say anything at all and just flies off into the sunset. Either way, it sucks. And what we can do in the design sprint is to get the boss involved. If the boss is involved, they can place their bets up front, and now it doesn't become so high stakes. It's a whole different game. We review those sketches. We do some kind of a structured critique that's all outlined in the sprint process. But the key here is the boss, the CEO, in the case of a startup, who'd be involved in this sprint is choosing 2 or 3 options, not just one usually, but 2 or 3, often that compete with each other. So we can keep alive this notion of there's more than one path and we're going to explore more than one. This is not the way most teams normally operate. Most teams are trying to find that one path as fast as they can, get on that path and work out all the details. In a design sprint, you're keeping alive parallel solutions. On Thursday, you prototype. Problem often, high stakes, perfect plan. Got this high stakes perfect plan. Now we're going to execute it. We're going to make it perfect. In a design sprint, we're building disposable simulations. So whereas with the high stakes perfect plan, maybe we build an MVP, we get it out in the real world with the idea that we're going to pivot, we're going to learn and change what we're doing later. In reality, we're just sort of testing our idea on hapless humans and often getting distracted and then doing something else. In a design sprint, we're able to stay focused because we're all in for this week. We look at what happens to these disposable simulations and we throw them away. Basically, if we build a prototype and you find that it sucks, you're ready to throw it away. Here's an example. Here's a team building this is a startup who were making an app to help people save money. So it's a money saving app for your phone. And here's 3 solutions for their marketing. They come up with fake brand names for all 3. They actually build prototypes that look different, exploring totally different directions here for how to explain what this product is and how it works. These prototypes are interactive, so they can set it up so that it feels for customers when they test it as if they're looking at 3 different products and they're shopping amongst these 3 and maybe amongst some real world competitors that already exist. On Friday, they test. So problem, arguing about what might happen. That's me arguing with Eric Schmidt. That's an argument I'm going to lose every time. In a sprint, we're going to watch it happen right now. We're going to watch one-on-one interviews with our target customers. So one person from the team interviewing a customer, 5 of these interviews, team watches and takes notes. We get instant results on those bets. The CEO, the decider, whoever they are, can see instantly, did they get it right or not? They can learn. And it's not a shame thing, right? It's just like, okay, all right, we learned. The whole purpose of this was to learn. So now we can rev it again. Doesn't take us a whole nother product cycle to get a whole nother MVP out there. No, all it takes is another few days to fix those prototypes, test it again. What I've seen time and time again is that the CEOs, their insight improves. They're able to build insight through these quick loops. So the next time they test, they'll know better what's in that fog. They'll be able to see further in. They'll have a better idea of how to get their vision into the right form so that it makes sense, so that we're closer to product market fit. You're building this insight now before you're building the product. That is really powerful because MVPs are usually built without that insight. There's certainly some insight there, but it's a hunch. In this way, we're able to add a lot more confidence to that hunch. So that's how it works. Map, sketch, decide, prototype, and test. That's the design sprint. In the example I gave, it turns out that Omni, this one that was really based on an FAQ. It turns out an FAQ is how you convince somebody to try a new financial services product if you're curious. And the language in this one turned out to be really important. And here's this company today. They're called Digit. And you can see this headline from the sprint. It's still in there. Digit automatically saves you money, so you don't have to think about it. It's right there in the text. So these sprints, a lot of times, even though they're fast, really good things can happen, but they're not about getting things right. They're actually about setting you on the course to find product market fit, trying to find the lane you need to be in to get there. And this is their product in the App Store today. They've done quite well. But the point of this is you're going from a world where you're trying to get it right, you're running a simulation before you get out into the real world. And often running multiple simulations. So you give yourself choice. Now, this I think is really important. You figure out choice, you figure out the right form to get it into the real world. This is a powerful thing you can do for your CEO. I want to tell you one story to illustrate this. I've run hundreds of design sprints, a lot of different companies. The story I want to tell you right now is about Slack. when Google Ventures, when I was working there, when we invested in Slack, they had been around for about a year as a separate, as a company focused on Slack. There's a longer story. It started off as a game company, but in terms of focusing on Slack and Slack being out in the real world, only been a little over a year. But the product was going nuts. It was at that time the fastest growing business app of all time. They had 500,000 daily active users, tons of daily active users. The challenge for them was figuring out how were they going to grow from there. So 500,000 daily active users is a ton. They had the ambition of growing really, really big, getting outside of sort of the Silicon Valley tech companies who were the early adopters. Eventually, you can't go too far if the only people who adopt you are tech companies. You need to reach new customers. And their idea for reaching these new customers was to use some of the money they had raised to run a big ad campaign. They were going to run a giant ad campaign, like ads on buses, ads in magazines, ads on TV, giant billboards. Here's an example of a billboard when they did run the campaign. So you'd be running, maybe you're driving down the freeway, you see this ad, you think it'd be great to get less email, but what's this thing, Slack? What is it? So you're going to go to slack.com. Now the challenge for Slack and their design sprint was to figure out what were they going to do. So assume the ad campaign reaches people. When they come to our website, how do we explain to them what Slack is? The first people, those 500,000 folks who have adopted Slack already, they've come in from word of mouth. Somebody who they know, a friend of theirs has said, hey, I'm using this tool in our company. You guys should check it out. And these are folks who are used to adopting new software because they're in the tech industry. It's more comfortable for them, perhaps. Now, as they expand into more traditional businesses, they want to find a way to explain what Slack is, what the benefits are when you come to the website, and they wanted to start from scratch doing that. So how should they explain Slack on the website? That was the purpose of the sprint. Now, on Monday, the team made the map. On Tuesday, they sketched. On Wednesday, they decided among several different competing sketches. And what happened was Stuart Butterfield, the CEO of Slack, he joined just for 30 minutes on Wednesday. So this is a very high value, I think, use of the CEO's time to come in for a moment in the sprint. You have another decider in the room, in this case, Mercy Grace. She's the head of product for Slack at that time. And Mercy makes all the decisions, and they decide Mercy's going to choose one solution. Stuart is going to choose one solution. The team will prototype both. We'll test them head to head in a Hunger Games style battle royale on Friday. So all these sketches up on the wall. Stuart walks through. He chooses one. Mercy chooses one. Stuart chooses an idea that was a favorite of his coming in, an idea that he'd been talking a lot about. And it was really clever. It's called the bot team. The notion with the bot team is you put people into a simulation of Slack so they can experience what it's like to message, because it's a hard thing to explain the way Slack works if you've never seen it before. So what are these messages like? What's it like? Well, in the bot team, you're going to be dropped into essentially it's like a video game of work. It's a fake work team. You're part of it. People will send you messages. They'll invite you to lunch, that kind of thing. They'll all be bots. They'll all be a bunch of code just sending messages back and forth to you so you can see what it's like. The other solution, the one Mercy chose, guide. It's very straightforward. You'll see on here a bunch of little bubbles explaining things, explaining the key features of Slack. Now, the reason Mercy chose this, I think, is because it's very straightforward. The text was really clear and good. This person chose which things to call out, and it seemed to make a lot of sense. So we've got a very straightforward approach, kind of maybe a bit boring, and then this maybe more sophisticated, clever approach. Clever versus boring, sort of the summary here. Thursday, the team builds a prototype. So they mock up the guide, make it look totally realistic. Click through, seems like a real website. Bot team, they decide to simulate using Slack. So they're going to call guide, they give it a fake name, Gather, whole fake brand, fake color scheme, everything. The bot team is going to happen inside Slack. When our target customers who are going to come in on Friday try out the Slack thing, they're going to go into an instance of Slack, and people on the team are going to act like the bots, being maybe not too intelligent, but writing to the customer as if they were a bunch of bots. On Friday, it's time for the test. And 5 customers try the bot team and the guide, both of them coming in through a news article that the team had written as if it was about these new communication software products. Bot team versus guide. Turns out the bot team, the founder's favorite, the solution they would have gone with if they hadn't done the design sprint, it confused the heck out of people. People were like, what's going on here? Like, why am I in a simulation of work? I just don't get it. The guide was a big hit. Boring actually won out here. And this was a really big deal to explain Slack to these target customers to the degree that they would say, yeah, I'm going to try this out. Like, that's hard. But what you really have to do with Slack is get people so convinced that they will not only try it themselves, but then convince their team to stop using email for a day and switch over to Slack. That's what it takes to adopt Slack in the early days. It's a hard sell. The guide, they thought after the sprint might be enough. So here's what they'd done. They'd had their strategy. They tried 2 approaches and they decided, all right, we're going with B. We're going to see what happens. So they built out the marketing and this experience with the guide. And you can see what it looked like in the real world here with these bubbles. And Slack's daily active users, they continued to go up. They ran the ad campaign. And I'm not going to say all this was due to the design sprint. But what did happen was they didn't screw it up. At the very least, they didn't screw it up. And the key principle behind this is this notion that by default, you can only make one bet. And a lot of those meetings, those pitches to the CEO, they're so high stakes because you can only make one bet or not. Yes or no. Here's the proposal. Are we going to do this or not? If we're going to do it, my God, we better get it right because we only have one shot to put it out into the real world. In a sprint, you effectively create parallel universes. And that's the notion, whether you're thinking about running a design sprint or not, that I want you to take away from this. You can forget about design sprints for a second. Think about this notion of parallel universes, giving yourself the option to jump between these different timelines of existence to see what it might look like if you made another choice and not deciding too soon. Options, being able to choose between multiple options, is always better than having one option and saying, yes or no, are we going to do this thing or not? That's pretty fragile. But if you say, are we going to do A or B or C or D? Then you make better decisions. I know you make better decisions because of my own anecdotal experience. I can see how much better my design work is when I am considering multiple solutions and pushing them forward. I've seen it working with companies who I've worked with. When you have multiple options, you make better decisions. I've seen it in my own life when I have multiple options, when it seems like I only have one option. I think, is there anything else I can do? Is there any other way to, is there any other place where we're looking for a home? Is there any other place we can look at? Is there any other sandwich I can get for lunch? When you have multiple options, you make better decisions. So this notion here of finding the right option out of multiple versus just having one, this is definitely better. There's a great book that talks about this. It's called Decisive by Chip and Dan Heath. It talks about a lot of the science behind this. But there's another proof point. There's another story. If you don't believe me and if you don't believe the reference to the book, we can talk about Steve. Okay, I said I wouldn't talk about Steve Jobs. And it doesn't seem to make sense because we know that Steve Jobs has perfect clarity of vision, right? He had perfect clarity. That's how he figured out that the world needed the iPhone, that the world needed the Mac, right? That the world needed the iPod, or that it wanted it anyway, even if it didn't need it. Well, I lied when I said I wasn't going to talk about Steve Jobs. In 2007, Apple came out with the iPhone. In 2005, they were trying to figure out what the iPhone should look like. There was no phone, right? Apple didn't have a phone in 2005. They had the iPod, they had the Mac, and Steve Jobs had the vision for a phone, but he didn't know exactly what form it should take. So he asked the team, he said, listen, I want multiple approaches. Specifically, he asked, maybe you've heard this story, but I love it, man. Let's look at one that's based off of the Mac. That's a UI based off the Mac that's like that desktop. Let's also look at one that's based off the iPod. The iPod in 2005 was a huge hit. Everybody's it's just like the most admired product in the world in 2005. Hard to remember that world, but that's what it was like. In 2005, the iPod, everything's iPod, right? No smartphones exist that look like modern smartphones. The iPod is where it's at. So Steve Jobs says, hey, we need to explore multiple solutions. They start to look at the iPod version. It seems stupid. He says, keep looking at it. We just don't know. Keep looking at it. So they keep working on these head to head. Here's a video of what these prototypes looked like. They were software prototypes, right? So they're running on real iPhones. But you can see, here's the iPod version that they tested out. It has a digital, like a virtual scroll wheel, just like the old iPods. Here on the right now is the one that's based off of Mac OS. So it has little objects you can tap. To us today, this seems obvious. It seems like, of course, it's clear, right? But it wasn't clear until they built it and they started testing it. Now, I talked a lot about running tests with customers, but the truth is, and has always been, that while it's really interesting to learn from your customers and valuable, and it teaches anyone valuable lessons about their product and improves their insight, the other audience for those prototypes, those competing prototypes, the other audience is your own team, your own selves. You really often don't know what's the right way to go until you put detail behind it and hold it in your hands. Now, as we know, the Mac OS version 1. Now, it's kind of hard to tell from these early prototypes, right? There's a lot of revision and things that went into it, but they threw away a bunch of time testing out competing versions to make sure they got it right. And it's cool. I'm always reluctant to tell Apple stories because they usually are impossible to emulate. But here's one you can emulate. You can do this. You can get through that fog by finding multiple paths, exploring them, and then seeing which ones work. So, how do you lead your CEO? Well, you give them choices and you prototype. You give them choices and you prototype. But no matter what you do here, I have to be honest. I don't have a recipe for you to become someone who's a peer of the CEO. I don't have a recipe to get you into the position where the CEO is listening to you, where you, if you don't agree with the vision, if you don't agree with the direction that arrow is headed to strategy, I don't have a solution or a recipe that gets you changing that 180 degrees and turning in a different direction. I don't have that. The CEO is still the boss, and oftentimes the shareholders are the boss of the CEO, or the peer pressure of other CEOs and super wealthy people are the boss of the CEO. There are a lot of forces at play. And in order to really think about what it means to you, we got to go back. We got to go back in time to the Big Bang. The Big Bang, I don't know how it worked, but there's a big explosion, a lot of atoms shoot out, right? And then eventually those atoms kind of start to clump together. They turn into stars sitting there for billions of years doing its thing, burning. Eventually it goes supernova, boom, more atoms shooting out. And now sort of those atoms slow down again, they clump up, they turn into a star, and the rest of that swirl kind of turns into the planets. And those atoms now, they're sitting there in like a puddle or something, gets hit by lightning. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows really, but all of a sudden you got life, right? You got a little multi-celled organism after a few, billion years of that after the lightning bolt. Then things start to happen. You get some evolution, and out of everything, I think 99% of all the species that have ever existed on Earth are now extinct. So all of this little flame of life passed from creature to creature to creature, makes its way through all the millions of years, all the millions of generations, past all the predators, past all the super volcanoes, past all the asteroids. It evolves from, a little walking fish thing to maybe rat thing to you eventually. Well, your parents anyway, and your parents make you, and you're a baby, and you're like, hey, you have to learn about the world, and you learn, hey, this is food, it goes in your mouth. This is an apple, it falls, that's gravity. This is a banana, this is a toilet. This is how you say please and thank you. It's how you be polite. You go to school and you got to learn what are the rules at school. And the kids tell you, hey, this is cool. This is not cool. And the teachers tell you, this is how you get a good grade. And this is what you need to do. And then you get a job and you learn from your colleagues about, hey, these are kind of the guidelines. This is what we're trying to do here. This is what's high status. This is what gets you promoted. This is what isn't so cool to do. You learn from their bosses and their bosses. And of course, the CEO is at the top of that pyramid. The CEO is who we're talking about. Now, it may be the case, and I hope it is for you, that you are 100% crystal clear on the arrangement, that you work for that big entity, that try though you might, with the best strategies I can give you as a person who's been at the bottom of that chain, the best thing you can do is to create choices. and to create prototypes that will help that entity and that CEO do what they want to do already. If you don't like what they intend to do, if you see this picture and you think, this is not the way I want to spend my precious human life, my precious atoms, because it is a very lucky thing to be a human being who's alive. All of the things it took to get to be you, it's crazy. So if you don't like the program, you can quit. And if I know it might not be that easy to quit, but you can create choices. You can prototype. And that might literally mean in the product that you're building and making it better. And that would be great. It might mean in the way your job is within the framework of the company that you're in, or the job that you're in, or the work that you do. It might be trying to find choices and prototyping, trying those things out. But what you can't do is just accept things as they are. And I hope maybe in some tiny way this was useful to you. Either way, thank you so much for listening and watching. I really appreciate it.
Hi, Jake. How are you doing? Can you hear me?
Hey, good.
Good. So, Jake, I was thinking of some, a good question to ask you, and I came up with one that I thought was really, really good, but I don't know if you'll like it, and I don't know if you'll give it like a good answer to it. So, I thought if
I probably won't give a good answer, but I probably like it.
I thought I'd better give you some options. So, I decided I'll come up with 3 options that you can choose from. And I promise you that none of them will be about design sprints. So here are 3 options for you, Jake.
Okay.
Question 1. In your talk, you talk about the history of the universe and the evolution of life. Very, briefly, but very accurately. Would you like to continue that story and explain the evolution of human consciousness? So that's option 1.
Okay.
Option 2, we've learned from your talk that we should give stakeholders options, like lots of things to choose from, and not just pitch one idea. But I'd like to know, what is a good set of options? Do you have any tactics? Like, how do you combine them? Is it just like 3 random things or something along those lines? That's question number 2. Your third option, and I lied. It is a question about design sprints. So the third question that you could choose is, I see a lot of people running design sprints when I don't think they should be running design sprints, or at least they shouldn't run a single design sprint. So I wonder, do you see the method being misapplied and overapplied? What's your experience of that? So those are 3 options for you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, those are all about design sprints, really, but including the history of human consciousness. But I think you should choose. We can talk about any of those, whichever one you think is best. Well, we can't talk about the history of human consciousness.
We'll skip that for now.
Fooled myself. I don't want to make it any worse. I think we should do. I think C is probably option 3 is probably the most interesting, but option B could be good too. So
I'd love to start with B then, which is, what is a good set of options that you present to someone? Is it just like 3 random things, or are you kind of pushing for variety, or are you guessing about the CEO's particular interests, or what's a good tactic?
Okay, cool. That sounds good.
Go for it.
Go for it. All right. So the option, the best way I know of to come up with good options is to get a lot of people in the room. I think that's one thing, is that it's sort of ludicrous to think that I'll know what all the options are. And one of the reasons why I wanted to start working in design sprints is because I realized that I wasn't coming up with the best solutions on my own. A lot of times somebody else on the team would come up later and say, like, hey, have you thought about doing it this way? And I think, oh God, I didn't think of that. And I wish I had, 2 months ago when we started coding this. So I do think it's good to involve other people. But if I had to say at broad brushstrokes what the archetypes of good options are, one archetype of a good option is the obvious solution. So like in the Slack story, there's a solution where you just say, what is the most obvious way to solve this problem? We want to explain this new product. Well, the most obvious way to do it is to put bubbles that call out this key feature, that key feature, that key feature. Or what's the most obvious way to design the UI for this new product? Because a lot of times the innovative thing that you're doing is you don't have to also create an innovative UI on top of the innovative technology, the innovative service, or whatever you're offering. You just need to deliver it in an obvious way. So obvious should always be one of the options. And then I think the other option should be risky, to take a chance. If something where we think if we do it in this way, there's a chance that we'll succeed wildly. This has the chance to be much more effective, to be much more powerful. But there's also a chance it'll fail. Those kinds of solutions are often discarded, unless the CEO, whoever the boss is really motivated to take that risk. Those things usually get rounded down. They turn into oatmeal as we sort of form consensus on our teams. And so those are kind of interesting. I think that the options I don't like are the ones that are kind of in the middle, where it's just sort of clever. It's kind of pushing obvious to trying to be clever. And a lot of times I think those waste effort and tend to fall flat. So I like obvious and risky.
I think that's really useful. I mean, isn't it the case in a lot of methods, including design sprints, where you just have people voting? Could you not have them pick out the most obvious one and also pick out the one that you would love to work if you were willing to take that risk or had the money? Could you push them towards those? Have you tried doing that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's actually a good idea. It could be a good modification on top of the design sprint process. I try to verbally push the decision maker in that direction. I think it's sometimes for decision makers, actually, it's quite hard. You might be, somebody might have the title of CEO of their small startup, but when they actually get in the room with all of their employees, all the people on their team, it's pretty hard for them to look everybody in the eye and say, hey, you know what, you all voted for this thing, but I believe in this other thing, and I want to do this instead of what you all want. And sometimes having that frame of, the thing that you're excited and passionate about, or the thing that I like the way you put it, or the thing that you think is the most obvious. It could be a nice lens.
Excellent. And question C, I believe. Do you recognize my claim that design sprints are often misapplied or over-applied, or is that something you're familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's kind of hard to believe, because I spend so much of my time obviously trying to convince people to run design sprints and consider them in the first place. And I think in most places, people haven't heard of it yet, haven't tried it, or haven't tried it in the right way. So I'm not ready to put on the brakes on trying to promote it. But I do think that there are many situations where if a design sprint is used as a replacement for understanding who your customer is, for doing research, for example, that's no good. If you're using a design sprint as a replacement for all of the hard design work that comes afterwards, that you need to do to work out all of the details, to work out the breadth of a big project. If you're using design sprints for really small problems and taking, sometimes people will compress and say that, well, we're going to do a design sprint. It's going to be 4 hours long, and we're not going to really do any of the steps. Those things, I can't guarantee those things will work, and it's certainly not meant to be anything except a way to start big projects. It's designed to be a great first week or first 2 weeks. You should do 2 iterations of it on a big project. And when it's used in other places, it's not the right tool for those things.
In your talk, you also mentioned that you can apply, the basic philosophy of coming up with multiple options, something you can apply in your real life. Not real life, in your life. What is something in your life, Jake, that you think would be good, that would, benefit from running a few experiments, a few parallel simulated realities?
So you're wondering what parts of my life are flawed?
Yeah, you need to prototype some stuff, Jake.
Yeah. I think one of the fundamental things that could use prototyping in my life is just like how I spend my days, like how I spend my work time specifically. Because I often find, and I think I talk to other people who this happens to as well, it's like the end of the day, and I'm like, what the hell did I do today? I was just in email all day, or just, and it's good. And, now it's like, well, I didn't even leave the home. I'm still just sitting here. I think that something that would be interesting is to say, I'm going to take the obvious solution to trying to make my days more effective when they're kind of administrative or open, or, work, this kind of classic work from home day. And I'm going to try like the radical risky, like, what if this really changed the game kind of approach. It's probably time to do that. I've done experiments like that in the past, but not since the pandemic. I kind of feel like I'm on my heels, kind of trying to cope with kids at home and, insanity, work, different hours, weird stuff. I think that's probably where an outside observer would say Jake could first make big improvements in his use of his precious human life.
It's funny that you say that you haven't tried it during the pandemic, which is really a period of time where that would be, we would really profit from breaking away from routine and trying new things. And also, I'm always amazed that we're a community of designers, but we don't experiment enough with other parts of our lives. We'll go into projects and we'll be really creative and come up with options, and then we'll go home and have the same meal that we had last week.
I've had tacos. We in our family decided, I don't know why, but to make tacos every single day of the pandemic, and we literally have, and it's actually been great. I think it's quite good to do the same things all the time sometimes. But you craft it, you perfect it, just how much cheese or whatever. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely room to apply these things. And one thing that I try to do, although it's difficult in real life because you're also living your life and you get locked in. It's not so easy to go home from the office or whatever. But I do try to experiment with something before committing. And so if you're thinking about a move, if you can stay in an Airbnb in the neighborhood, or we were thinking during the pandemic, we decided maybe we should move up to the back to the small town where I grew up. But before we did that, we've spent a year living at my mom's house, which is where I am now, and I'm gesturing to the sort of spooky backdrop. And it's been good. It's been kind of crazy living with my mom for a year, but it's been a really good, experiment. And it's a prototype. We weren't sort of committed yet. We weren't all the way moved up. And I think things like that, they can help you take bigger risks sometimes, but it's hard. It's hard to do it with your life.
I think I really like the way you went, spending time in an Airbnb as a prototype of moving somewhere. And really, you should have, stayed with the friends and with their mum for a couple of days just to see, prototype moving in with your mum.
Oh, I've tried that.
You tried that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm invited. Yeah, I just sort of show up. Yeah,
that's good stuff.
Doesn't go as well as you might think.
So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time, Jake. Really enjoyed chatting with you and enjoyed your talk here at From Business to Buttons. Have a great day, and thank you once again.
Thanks so much.